All right, thank you very much, Julia, for the kind introduction, and thanks to everyone who showed up for this. I just dropped into the chat a link to the Google slideshow that I'm presenting for future reference if you would like to use it. So this talk that I'm giving today is largely based off of the third chapter of my book project, Julian Augustus, Myth, Platonism, and the Refounding of Rome, where I look specifically at how Julian articulates his identity as specifically a Roman emperor and as a Roman among Greeks, and his relationship between, and how he views the relationship between Greece and Rome in this sort of dual culture that he inhabits in late antiquity. And one more thing on this slide I'd just like to point out here. About a year ago, I commissioned this glorious portrait of Julian from Flora Kirk, who is the British-based artist behind Flero Illustrations. She does a wonderful series of imperial portraits as well as other great classical art. So I just want to give a shout out to Flora there. Okay. So last summer, I visited the UK for the first time, and one of my top priorities was to go to the Hampton Court Palace in order to spend a good amount of time viewing and documenting and taking pictures of this particular room within the Hampton Court Palace, the King's Staircase, which features several mural paintings by the Italian artist Antonio Verrio, who painted it, completed around 1702. And what this series of murals depicts is a myth, an original myth that the Emperor Julian wrote in the form of a satirical / Platonic dialogue that he probably titled Symposium, or the Chronia, that is the Saturnalia. It is now familiarly known today as the Caesars. And so this is sort of your kind of panoramic view of the staircase as you're walking up. So you'll see there's Julian over here, there's the Caesars here, there's the gods in heaven / Olympus over here. And so this is a bit of a closer look. So in the dialogue, which is the focus of the fourth chapter of my book, Julian says that the god Hermes, the god of literature, dictated this story to Julian, and he's writing it down here dutifully. And what the story is essentially there is a banquet of the gods, a symposium of the gods on Mount Olympus in the heavens. And one of these gods, one of the more recent gods, is Romulus, deified as Quirinus. And Romulus decides that, well, it's the Saturnalia, let's have a special party, and let's invite all of my descendants, that is, all of the Roman Caesars, to take part in this celestial banquet. So you see here Romulus with mummy she-wolf here. And I wasn't able to get a good picture of kind of the main event part of the wall murals because there was glare from the windows, but this is one I found on Wikisource. And you can see here that Romulus is here advocating on behalf of the various deified Roman emperors who have ascended to the heavens, though they are not at the level of the gods. And what Romulus is asking in this myth is, could I invite one of my imperial descendants here to dine with the gods as their equal? And so the gods agree, yeah, why don't we hold a contest of speeches, just like in Plato's Symposium, over who is the most worthy Roman emperor to ascend to equality with the gods. And that all seems well and good, but then Romulus's Greek equivalent, as it were, Heracles, says, well, wait a minute, you're judging all of these Roman emperors. Why don't we try to make this a contest over who is the best ruler of all time? And let's see if one Greek can outmatch all of these Romans. And he says, why don't we bring my Alexander into the contest? And so Alexander comes swaggering in. And so he becomes part of this contest of speeches and cross-examinations to determine who was the best ruler. And as you can see here, Antonio Varro had a specific interpretation of the outcome of this contest that was not an uncommon interpretation, is he thought that Alexander essentially won. Okay, Alexander representing the superiority of Greece over Rome, etc. And you can see this is suggested by the goddess Victory being at Alexander's side. And then you can see the symmetry here of the goddess Justice on the Roman side, about to punish various Roman Caesars for their shortcomings, as you see in the dialogue. Other thing worthy of note here is the kind of the Socrates equivalent in this symposium is the satyr Silenus, who makes a lot of satirical remarks about various characters, including during the cross-examinations. So it's my favorite thing written by Julian. It is an absolutely delightful dialogue, and if you've heard me talk about it, you can tell. Well, if you dig a little deeper into the history of this wall mural at Hampton Court, you find that it is likely that the Alexander strutting into this contest is the representative of the British monarch William III of Orange. And there's been various interpretations of what this means, whether this is Alexander/William coming in and kicking out the Catholics, as it were, the Romans, or another interpretation more recent is that Alexander is William III, and that the Romans, especially Julius Caesar, represent his main rival in France, that is King Louis XIV. Okay, but in other words, definitely Alexander/William III is represented as the triumphing figure in this mural, through the interpretation of that dialogue. However, Antonio Varro also recognizes by reading the Caesars that Julian nevertheless had his favorites in this dialogue, and the most common interpretation, which is not wrong, is that the real winner of the dialogue is the philosopher emperor, as it were, Marcus Aurelius, who also takes part in the contest. And you can see here, Varro suggests that affinity with Julian because he is the only emperor in the painting besides Julian who has a beard. You can see they're similarly dressed, and they're looking at each other from across the corner of the room there. As I argue in this chapter, however, I would say that while Julian certainly does admire Marcus Aurelius as a model philosopher, his imperial model as a proper Roman emperor is actually Octavian Augustus, who here is, as in the dialogue, is being advised by the philosopher Zeno here. And I believe that Julian, rather than presenting himself as a Greek Hellenic philosopher-king, he is actually presenting himself more as a Roman emperor who is interested in philosophy and benefits ethically from philosophy, but is ultimately not himself a professional philosopher, and rather he is advised by professional Greek philosophers like Zeno here advising Octavian. Okay, but that is for another time. Now, to feature another one of Flora's wonderful imperial portraits here, another so-called Phil-Hellenic emperor that has been compared to Julian is also the Emperor Hadrian, largely because of the beard, but for other reasons. And it seems that in the reception of Julian by his near contemporaries, such as the historian Ammianus Marcellinus, he seems to show that Julian was viewed very much like Hadrian when his soldiers would refer to him, and people at court of the Emperor Constantius would refer to him as a Greek or a Greekling, a Graeculus, which is the same epithet that was applied to Hadrian. In other words, Julian had this reputation that even though he was serving as a Roman emperor, as a Caesar at this point, before he became an Augustus and ruled in his own right, he was viewed as this Greek who was, a sophist. He was interested in oratory and philosophy, and he was very un-Roman. He was essentially othered in relation to the Romans. And so this is the reputation he seems to be saddled with by his contemporaries and near contemporaries, and this affects his reception. And of course, we can actually look at how Julian views somebody like Hadrian in the Caesars, because he is one of the deified emperors who is not in the contest. However, he still attends the banquet. And Julian characterizes Hadrian thus, quote, "Next after Trajan enters a pompous man with a long beard, a practitioner of many arts, music especially, often gazing at the sky and prying into its secrets. Silenus looked at him and said, 'What do you think of this sophist? Surely he can't be looking for Antinous here. Someone tell him the lad's not here and put a stop to his foolery and nonsense.'" So here Julian is imposing upon and sort of reinforcing a lot of Greek stereotypes made by Romans, as well as by going back all the way to old comedy, looking upon them as, these people who are atheists and liars and deceptive. And also, Julian really has it out for Greek pederasty in this dialogue, as you can see here, from calling him out, for his relationship with Antinous, as well as his presumption that he should deify Antinous. And I also read into that Julian is also criticizing the deification of a human being in the form of Jesus, in his attack on Christianity. So in other words, Julian would be horrified if people were to compare him to Hadrian because of Hadrian's reputation as a Phil-Hellene. Well, I think Hadrian being saddled with that reputation is actually similar to Julian being saddled with that reputation. And that if we look at Hadrian's kind of own self-styling, you see that they have more in common. And one thing I just want to point out here is the way that they wore their beards on the majority of their portraiture. And for Julian, we only have coins. For Hadrian, we have coins and statues, but here's a nice juxtaposition. You can see here that they have a similar short beard. And now some of Julian's coins, he has a longer beard, but the majority of them that we have, the majority of his coin types have a shorter beard like this, similar to what Hadrian has in all of his portraiture. Now, traditionally, Hadrian's short beard is read as a symbol of his Philhellenism. He wants to present himself as Greek as much as Roman, if not more Greek than Roman. However, if you look into some of more recent scholarship, we come to find that Hadrian's beard, while it may signal his Philhellenism, it is much more similar to the beards that were typically worn by Roman soldiers during the Trajanic era. During the time of his predecessors, as we can see on many of the faces of the soldiers on Trajan's column, as well as on Trajan's arch at Beneventum here. And that short military beard is typical of soldiers, and is also explains why you have short beards on the so-called soldier emperors in the 3rd century, which was also typical of the portraiture of tetrarchs after them, such as Diocletian here. So now we can look at this juxtaposition between, say, soldierly beards like that of Hadrian, Diocletian, or Julian, with more philosophical beards, longer philosopher beards like that of Marcus Aurelius, and we see that there is at least a bit of a difference here. And so I would argue that Julian's beard, is not necessarily exclusively something that marks him out as a Philhellene or a Greek philosopher, but is also very much hearkening back to his wish to identify with his fellow troops and present himself much more like a tetrarch, much more like a soldier emperor, who is one of the guys, as it were, as opposed to, say, the clean-shaven Constantine or Constantius, who presented themselves much more as a sort of Apollonian sort of semi-divine figure who was very much above everyone else. Okay. So this leads me to what I call the treason of assumptions, or referring to the René Magritte painting, the La Trahison des Images, right, the treason of images. And I believe that the assumption that Julian saw himself as more Greek than Roman, or he saw Greece superior to Rome, is one of these many assumptions that I am challenging in this book that I think are held by scholars that are all kind of mutually reinforcing each other. And I think a point of reference I want to use here is this face. This is from a statue that is in the Musée de Cluny in Paris. And this was long thought to be a statue of the Emperor Julian. Okay. However, art historians have determined that it's actually a statue from the 2nd century of a priest. So it's not actually Julian. However, a lot of people, nevertheless, the assumption that this is of Julian popularly persists. Okay. However, it's the case, ceci n'est pas Julien, right? This is not Julian. Okay. The treason of images here, the treason of assumptions. And what I'm trying to do with this book, and what I'm going to try to argue today, is that Julian, the assumption that Julian favored Greece over Rome, or favored himself as Greek over Roman, is I want to turn it into one of these assumptions that, in very much the same way as people assume that statue was from just looking at it. Okay. And the thing about these assumptions is they all tend to reinforce each other in a kind of cycle. Okay, so another assumption that builds into this is that he emulated Alexander the Great, okay, the ultimate Greek. And I and others like Roland Smith have argued against that. And another thing I'm arguing against is that Julian presented himself as a Hellenic philosopher, or a Hellenic philosopher-king. And I'm also arguing against that, as have folks such as Dominic O'Meara. I also argue that he directly emulated Marcus Aurelius as an example of a philosopher-king. And finally, another assumption that has been argued recently by folks such as Susanna Elm and David Greenwood, is that Julian, in his self-presentation, had pretensions to semi-divinity, presenting himself as a semi-divine figure who has a special relationship to the gods such as Helios, right? And even to the point where he is presenting himself as an rival to Jesus Christ. Okay, and so you can see how that fits into his emulation of Alexander with his God complex, and all of these assumptions mutually reinforce each other. And so this is something I want to systematically challenge. But today, for the next 25 minutes that I have left, I want to kind of focus on what are the arguments for and against Julian favoring Greece over Rome, or Rome over Greece. And so I just want to show that there's remarkably little scholarship that actually addresses this question, and what does seems to originate with this 1978 article by Jean-Pierre Weiss, where he basically says things like, he was anti-Roman, especially in the Caesars, that he wished to replace Roman cult with some new type of religion, some Hellenic religion, and that he wanted to essentially construct Constantinople, his hometown, as a menace, right, as a rival to Rome, assuming that he favored Constantinople over Rome because he was born there. Now, this article seems to have influenced later scholarship. So if you look at the big volume by Mary Beard and Simon Price and others on Roman religion, there is basically one line about Julian, and it basically says that he showed little interest in the traditional cults of Rome. And then a single citation for that line is the article by Weiss. And more recently, such as Don den Hengst makes more assumptions, says that Julian is a Hellene. How did he view Rome? Apparently, he He thinks that Julian did not have much real knowledge about the Romans, though he did know Latin. He had little respect for Roman history in the Caesars because he's lampooning everyone, and that he assumes that Alexander the Great is and Marcus Aurelius are the two men in that dialogue who come out on top. And he assumed he likes Marcus Aurelius because he wrote his meditations in Greek. However, the scholarship largely argues that Julian did not actually read the meditations, despite seeming to admire Marcus. Now, whoops. Come on. There we go. So thankfully, I do have an ally in some of what I'm talking about today. In 2002, the German scholar Karl Classen had some things to say from his reading of Julian's own writings. And he said things like, well, in Julian's oratory, he actually cites a lot of Roman exempla in addition to Greek exempla, even though he is writing in Greek, where his paideia, his education, would have only taught him Greek models, from the classical or Homeric period to use. But Classen demonstrates that he employs plenty of Roman exempla with great skill and conscience. Another thing which I build upon is that it seems that if Julian has a model in history, it is the king Numa Pompilius of the Romans that he sees as the originator of Roman religion, qua Roman religion, and that he was in fact a theurgist, I argue, and that as I agree with Classen, that Julian certainly aspired to be to reach Numa's level of philosophical skill. Another thing that Classen argues again is that, which I think is correct, is that Julian is more or less consistent in arguing that the Romans were militarily superior to the Greeks and everyone else, though something I would push against is that he would admit that Alexander the Great probably would have won if they went head to head. Finally, what Classen says is that though Julian largely relies on Greek sources and uses a lot of Greek examples and citations, and he admits that the Greeks are intellectually superior to the Romans, he nevertheless demonstrates that he has a very thorough knowledge and understanding and familiarity of Roman culture. Okay, so these are a lot of things I build upon, and so from Klassen's work. So I definitely want to acknowledge that. So when we're dealing with Julian's self-presentation, we have to kind of be careful because we really want to try to have Julian speak in his own voice and not have other sources get in the way of that. And so I just have a bit of a Venn diagram that you kind of have to work with. So Julian has orations, invectives, letters, hymns, and satires where he represents himself as an author. Okay, and so these are, of course, the primary evidence for his self-presentation. However, because he's also an emperor, there are other media that he presents largely in Latin, where he does seem to have some influence over crafting that image. However, a lot of that message is also filtered through imperial conventions, through the consistory, and so this is what happens with coins and laws, for instance. And then finally, the thing we have to be careful of is a lot of these contemporary sources that like to impose upon Julian certain identities, especially Greek identities. And these will be Greek sources like his proponents, Libanius, Himerius, and Themistius, and Eunapius as well, and his enemies as well, such as Gregory Nazianzus. And also inscriptions. Okay, the majority of inscriptions about Julian were not written by Julian. They're not his own words. They were commissioned and written by other people who, again, are going in both Greek and Latin, are going to impose certain identities upon him. And of course, we also have Latin sources such as Mamertinus and Ammianus, who are also reading Julian a certain way. Okay, so the first thing I'd like to address is, just to ground ourselves here, is his views of the city of Rome versus the city of Constantinople. Now, he was born in Constantinople. However, the evidence about his own view of Constantinople is somewhat equivocal. So he does say that he has kind of an affection and a nostalgia for that part of the world where he grew up. He was the first emperor born in Constantinople. He was raised in that general area of Asia Minor. And so, of course, he's going to have some affinity for affiliation and affinity for that. However, we see in the letter to the Alexandrians, for instance, he says, well, the city needs this obelisk from Alexandria to be set up in Constantinople. And he's framing this as the city is asking for this. And because she is my fatherland, or my motherland rather, I have to, this is sort of an obligation I have to do. So he's not really presenting this as his own wish. Okay, he's presenting this as more, he has to do this because, you know, they asked and I have a duty to my motherland. Finally, as Maria Garcia Pilar Ruiz pointed out, in the Caesars is a possible hint of a dig at Constantinople through Constantine, representing Constantinople as a sort of garden of Adonis. In other words, just like Christianity, it's a project that Constantine, you know, undertook that will quickly pass away. And it's quite possible that Julian may have simply reversed the foundation of Constantinople back to Byzantium, okay, by reopening the pagan temples there, because honestly, he probably would have had a rather ambiguous relationship to Constantinople because of its association with its Christian founder and his uncle and his that side of the family that you know, killed his side of the family essentially once Constantine died. Rome, on the other hand, throughout his writings, both as Caesar and Augustus, he calls it my city or our city, okay, he metera polis. Often he calls it the reigning city, the Basulausa polis. He calls that 4 times, right? And even 3 times he calls the city Theophiles, okay, beloved of the gods, right? So he never calls Constantinople any of these things, okay? He is clearly acknowledging Rome's supremacy and honor, you know, as an author and an emperor, okay? He also calls Rome the mother and teacher of virtues, which is very interesting. So it's not only kind of the de facto capital that gets lip service, but he even sees that Rome itself and its and the people who come from there are models of virtue. And so one thing he's going to argue is that the Romans as an ethnos, okay, were actually particularly virtuous, wise, pious, courageous. And that is why they were able to dominate the world, whereas the Greeks, okay, less so. And even in his oratory, where he is at least paying lip service to his predecessors, he seems to undermine it a bit. He says that Constantine established rather than founded Constantinople in such a short amount of time. He doesn't use oikis, though, the word for founding. And then he says that it is inferior to Rome as much, it is superior to other cities as much as it's inferior to Rome. Okay, so again, that can be read rather ambiguously, and I would recommend Sean Tuffer's article on his first oration. Okay, another thing is Julian's relationship with the Roman Senate, okay, which is something that I think has been a little misunderstood. So according to Zosimus, Julian, when he essentially became a usurper, and he made war on his cousin Constantius in the year 361. He wrote a series of manifestos to a select group of cities. And these were public letters that were read elsewhere, but these were the nominal addressees, and they were the Athenians, the Spartans, and the Corinthians, which is very interesting, okay, because these were not cities that were politically or strategically important in the 4th century CE. However, these were places of great historical and cultural importance, specifically to do with Greek Hellenism. On the evidence of Ammianus and others, it seems that another one of these letters, such letters, was written to the Senate of Rome. In other words, including Rome in this collective of cities that represent what Julian thought was the core of his cultural, political, and religious program. Now, when Julian did write that letter to the Roman Senate, basically denouncing Constantius's crimes against his family and all of that, Ammianus says that the Roman Senate, both pagans and Christians in the Roman Senate, unanimously rejected this manifesto by this usurper. And my reading of that is that, well, yes, Julian was about to face a numerically superior force in the form of the legitimate Emperor Constantius, and that the Emperor Constantius also had a winning record in civil war against folks such as Magnentius. And so naturally, the Roman Senate is going to calculate how are they going to keep their heads on their shoulders. More likely, they're going to back the person they think that's going to win. Okay. However, after Constantius miraculously just died of a fever before civil war could be fought, and Julian ascended the throne by right of blood without any bloodshed, Julian then made consistent overtures to the Senate, and it seems to me that he wanted to involve Roman senators in his imperial government to a perhaps greater degree than even was customary. And he did this through two ways. I'll actually jump down to the last bit of evidence here. Now, at this time, Roman senators, okay, who would have only occupied civilian posts in this post-Diocletian world, would have been assigned things like the urban prefecture of Rome or the governorship of Africa. Julian seems to have awarded posts beyond this immediate region of Italy to Roman senators, such as Spain, as well as even places in the east, such as the governorship of Achaia, as well as the position of comes orientis. He's offering these to Roman senators. Okay, that's unusual. Also, it seems that Julian had a greater relationship with the pagan kind of religious conservatives among the Roman Senate, such as Praetextatus, whom Ammianus says was actually present when Julian was enacting a lot of his reforms during his first 5 months of rule in Constantinople. And Praetextatus was a senator not just who was a champion of traditional Roman cult, but was also enrolled in the Eleusinian Mysteries. He was in the cult of Mithras, and he wrote philosophical tracts. And so I think these were two figures. He was a figure that Julian very much had much in common with, and it seems that they collaborated. And this is perhaps Praetextatus was a major source of Julian's understanding of Roman religion. So now we go from that to how does Julian view the relationship between the Romans and the Greeks? Well, this is a time where people like Julian, drawing on sources such as Dionysius Halicarnassus, would argue that the Romans and the Greeks were, for the most part, functionally, both racially and culturally the same. And so, for instance, in the Against the Galileans, he argues that the Greeks and Romans are the superior civilization to, say, the Christians and the Hebrews, because the gods have clearly favored them historically, right? And that both us Romans, he always refers to the Romans as us, and often the Greeks as them, and the Greeks are our kinsmen. And again, he's pairing Greek and Roman exempla. So he says that, Among the famous lawgivers superior to Moses are folks like the Spartan Lycurgus, the Athenian Solon, okay, and then the Romans just in general, okay, are better lawgivers. And Julian also is arguing that in order for these lawgivers to be successful in giving laws to people, those people already have to be naturally predisposed to obey such laws, right? And so he would argue that the Greeks and Romans are naturally, okay, civic-minded, politikos, okay, and philanthropos, right, lovers of humanity, while at the same time, they are also courageous and warlike. Okay, so they're the perfect combination of all the necessary virtues for, a race that would rule the world, unlike certain others. Okay. However, it seems that Julian is suggesting that even though the Greeks and Romans are, in terms of their kind of natural pedigree, their genos, as well as their virtues of piety and civic-mindedness, functionally the same. However, Julian into King Helios argues that the Romans, being a fundamentally Greek race, are perhaps the best example of a Greek race. Okay, he says that while they are Greek in terms of genos, in terms of nationality, they establish a civic order no worse than any of the best governed cities, if not superior to every other constitution that were ever put to use. Okay, so he says that the Romans were, in a sense, perhaps the culmination and the supreme model of a Hellenic constitution, a civic order. Also in the Hymn to Helios, he talks about the superiority of Roman religious practices, and he talks specifically of original Roman religious practices that go all the way back to the city's founding with its first two kings. So, for instance, he argues that Romulus was sent down from the gods not just by Ares or Mars alone, but he also descended from the supreme god Helios. Okay, and what he's arguing here is that the Romans have a special connection to the supreme god Helios, who is Helios Basileus, the king of the gods, okay, Julian's sole invictus, if you will. And so he argues that King Numa, again, this Roman king that he highly admired, he argues, reading sources such as Plutarch and Dionysius, that things like the cult of Vesta are actually a form of the cult of Helios, because the flame comes directly from the sun. He also argues that the Romans, like the Egyptians, are especially pious and connected to the sun god because they use a solar calendar rather than a lunar calendar like the Greeks. Okay, and this is proof that the Romans were naturally more intelligent and pious, and that is a mark of honor to Helios that they start the calendar at the winter solstice rather than at a time that makes more sense agriculturally. If we look at other works, namely the Mesopogon, okay, we see that Julian, in fact, often leverages his non-Greek or Roman identity against the Greeks in many respects. So, for instance, against the Galileans, okay, when he's talking about the Christians, he says that the Christians, or the Galileans, that is, they took what he called the worst elements from Jewish and Greek culture. And from Greek culture, they took the mean and filthy lifestyle from our indolence and vulgarity. And this seems to be the only place where Julian really refers to the Hellenes as us, as a religious and cultural category. But when we get to the Mesopogon, okay, where he is essentially making fun of himself, at the same time he is kind of showing how he's so different from the Greek citizens of Antioch. Okay, he says that even though culturally I trained myself in the habits of the Greeks, of Hellenes, naturally my genos is actually Thracian. Okay, I am descended from the Illyrian emperors who were Latin speaking, right? And that I was trying to legislate based on laws that were fit for people that were like myself, Thracians, Illyrians, when in fact, no, you're Greeks, so it's not going to work. Whereas in the Misopogon, he often compares himself to Cicero, Cato the Elder, and other Romans who have historically had bad relations with certain Greek cities. So for instance, he compares himself to the Roman ambassadors who went to the city of Tarentum in an event that precipitated the war with Pyrrhus of Epirus. And what happened to the Roman ambassadors at Tarentum is, well, one, they defiled their togas with excrement, but they also made fun of the Roman ambassadors for speaking Greek with a Latin accent. Okay. And several times Julian, and this isn't the only instance where Julian likes to use Latin terms in his writing in order to kind of signal his Roman identity. So when he's talking to the people of Antioch, he says, well, I gave you all of this grain in the form of modii, okay, as it is native to call it in Latin. Okay, so even though his native language is Greek, he is pretending that it is actually Latin here. Okay. As for the connection to Alexander the Great, I don't have the time to go over a lot of the evidence that Roland Smith has already put together to show that Julian did not actually admire Alexander the Great as a model. He seemed to only admire Alexander's military skill, his valor, his courage, his sense of strategy, but as an ethical model, he was very much not that. I think the only thing on this point I would like to show is how he represents Alexander in the Caesars, which I think is quite funny. So in the Caesars, Julius Caesar calls out Alexander for his cruelty toward the city of Thebes, as well as to his own friends. Alexander says, well, I felt bad about it later, at least, which is a poor kind of excuse. Alex also says the Romans would be no match for the Greeks in their prime, and Julian in his letter to the Alexandrians is rather ambiguous on that point. He said mainly that the Romans might have a real agon, a real contest against him, but not necessarily lose to him. Later in the Caesars, there are cross-examinations by the god Hermes, and he asks essentially Alexander what is best in life, and Alexander on cue, very much like Conan the Barbarian, says to conquer all. And Silenus comes in and says, well, you couldn't even conquer yourself, referring to Alexander's ethical shortcomings. Then Dionysius says, oh, don't provoke him or he might murder you just like he did Clitus. Okay, so this was a very sick burn, as they say, and Alexander's response only was to burst into tears, and that is the last we hear of him in the dialogue. Okay, so I'm done, and I'm just going to give some conclusions here to wrap up. So I would argue that Julian's Greek biases are imposed by Greek contemporaries, and that a lot of that is inherited by modern scholars in a form of assumptions of his pro-Hellenism, as you will. Okay, again, I'm not arguing that he's anti-Hellenic or anti-Greek, okay, but he has a more nuanced understanding of how he fits his own identity and how he views the Romans as a Greek race. Okay, and so we have Themistius, Himerus, Libanius, and other Greek authors to thank for imposing these assumptions upon him. So for instance, Himerius very much imposes on Julian this idea that he was very pro-Constantinople. I would argue that Julian identifies with and prefers Romans to Greeks in any situation where the two are distinguished from each other, and he often distinguishes the two, even though he also admits that they are very much similar, if not functionally the same, as an ethnos. As I've seen, he seems to have active interest in the city of Rome, relations with its senate, and an understanding of its state cults, however much he might interpret them philosophically as really cults of the sun god. He believed the Romans naturally were more pious, more closely connected to the supreme god Helios, and of course that they were militarily superior. And finally, his emulation of Alexander is very much overblown. Alexander certainly was a military model, but not a cultural or ethical model. Okay, And so, for instance, his objectives in the Persian campaign, where he lost his life, were probably much more limited than any sort of Alexander complex, where he wanted to conquer the whole Persian Empire, if not get all the way to India and stuff. Okay. So here's my bibliography, short bibliography you can peruse. Again, I put the in the chat the link to the slides, so you can use those as you please. And thank you for your attention.